Welcome back to another episode. I'm Daniel Druger, my co-host James Barrow, and James, my mind was blown from this interview.
Yeah, that was awesome. We just finished interviewing one of the co-authors of ActivityPub, which is the open source protocol that Instagram just built threads on top of. And the reason why it's such a crazy thing is that when you use threads, which I know people right now aren't using as much as everyone thought they would, but I think they will still. If you follow anyone, you create posts, you can now, because of this protocol, move them off of threads onto another app that's also using it. So it has a huge impact on how monetization, usage, social networks in general are going to work. And we're really, really lucky to have Evan, who's one of the co-authors of this, sit down and talk to us. So with that, let's get to the interview. Can't wait to get feedback on this one.
Evan is one of the co-editors of ActivityPub and has spent more than 15 years working on distributed social network protocols. He ran an open source social project called StatusNet, formerly chaired the W3C working group on social web standards, and is now the director of open technology at Open Earth, where he builds digital architecture to scale climate action. So Evan, welcome to the podcast. Clearly doing a lot. Excited to jump into this with you.
Thanks, Daniel. Really great to be here.
Well, why don't we start from the top? Kind of just give us some background on what is Activity Hub, the W3C, Fediverse, kind of all these terms that are being thrown around.
Yeah, boy, it's a lot of different terms in there, right? I'm going to start off with the maybe the top idea, which is distributed social networks, which you got in there, and the paradigm that we've all gotten used to over the last, say, roughly 20 years of social networks on the internet is one of silos or walled gardens, is the way that we kind of use the term. And the idea being that, say, if you have a Facebook account, you can only make friends with other people who have Facebook accounts, and you can only use your account to read other stuff that was posted on Facebook. And it sounds funny to say it out loud because it's like, it seems so simple and natural, but it would be really interesting is if you had an account on Facebook and you could follow someone on LinkedIn, make a connection. And when they post their content on LinkedIn, you receive that on your feed in Facebook and you can read it directly. So you don't necessarily have to have an account on LinkedIn in order to connect to people and have those connections. All of our social networks seem to work with these barriers around them. So you have to have an account, all the content stays within it. And distributed social network says, hey, what if we loosen that up and we allowed connections between social networks, so you can follow people and content that's really interesting to you without having to check 10 different apps all day long.
And in your vision of that, it's interesting because as you're saying it, and I was just thinking about email. It's just like, it's amazing that like we all got email and took that for granted. I guess like I didn't even think about the fact that like I can shoot you a note to Outlook from Gmail, and it's in some ways it's kind of what you're articulating, right, at the high level.
Absolutely. A lot of our communications mechanisms work this way. Email is a great example. If I have my email account at openearth.org and you've got an email account at Outlook, we can send each other email without worrying about without having to like get separate accounts on other systems or things like that. It's just very natural federated format. It's what we use for, say, phone systems. When I send you an SMS from my Canadian phone, it goes from my phone company to your phone company to your phone, and we just never even think about it. It just goes back and forth automatically. Now, there is a lot of communication happening on the back end that makes that possible, but sending a snail mail letter or using the web, these are all protocols that depend on that kind of federated system that lets us cross organizational boundaries.
And if we definitely want to get into how Threads, has talked about using it, but if we had a world of these federated apps, does that also mean that like I could take my entire graph with me? So if I were, using let's just use Twitter. I know everyone's sort of picking on, or I guess X. But if I found that for some reason or another, I don't want to be there anymore, could I then take my graph with you? It's the equivalent of like in our world, like the Facebook Graph API is everything,
Yeah.
right? And I can take that and I can basically, give other apps the opportunity to read that. But in this world, I basically be like, okay, I can write this to somewhere else, and Twitter takes it away.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the promise. It's not a necessary part of having distributed social networks, being able to move between networks, but we call that data portability. So being able to say, "Hey, I've built up these connections. I have people that follow me or people that I follow, and just because I want to change my, social network provider doesn't mean I want to lose all those connections." And so that is a important part of the promise of federated social networks. And we're all used to it again from like changing your phone system from AT&T to Verizon, right? Like it's just go from one to the other, and all your contacts stay the same, and all your phone number stays the same, and nobody needs to care except you're paying a lower bill, right? And the same thing should happen with social networks. If you change the social network that you use as your main social network, nobody else should have to care, right? It should all kind of come with you to your other system.
And the social networks, I mean, it's been around now for 25 plus years. And so you've been working on this for the life of social networks. And so, what was it in the beginning that maybe you identified to say, okay, some federated network is important here. We should start to establish that. And then how has the evolution of both social networks, but the technology and the philosophies around it have evolved over time?
Yeah, yeah. So, we mentioned email. I think in the early days of the internet, a lot of our protocols were built on this federated model, right? So you have a domain and people have accounts on the domain and they connect across domains. When the first social networks were coming online, so Facebook in 2006, Twitter in 2007, the existing paradigm was blog networks, right? So people would have a, say, WordPress account that they would set up, they would do all their publishing there, and then their friends would follow them using a standard called RSS, right? It was a little clunky. You had a separate RSS reader from your blog, and so it wasn't really very smooth, but it was the kind of dominant way that social networks worked at that time. And it did have this kind of federated mechanism. So when the first, when Twitter launched, when Facebook launched, LinkedIn, I think I had seen these and said, okay, these are great, but let's see what we can do to reintegrate this federated idea into the social networks. So I launched a network in 2008 called Identica, and part of launching that network was launching a protocol called OStatus that allowed us to do this remote following between networks.
Got it. And so then how has that evolved into what is today ActivityPub? And maybe you can just give us and listeners a primer of what that is.
Yeah, great thing. So OStatus again started in the 2008, 2009, 2010. It was based on a stack of technologies that were developed at Yahoo and Google. So, and I'm going to start throwing out some names: OAuth, OpenID, XML. It used Atom, and then it had a bunch of other PubSub, Salmon, Webfinger. So a few protocols that had been developed in that time period, and it was kind of assembled ad hoc out of those. We hit kind of a peak in, say, 2011, 2012, when Google launched its product called Google Buzz, which supported this stack. So you could use Identica and you could follow people with their Google accounts on Google Buzz.
Cool.
Pretty exciting step. Google eventually, as sometimes happens at Google canceled that project, so it was no longer available. And that kind of first wave of distributed social networks kind of advanced and receded. What came next was a few changes. Probably the big one was a change from the underlying representation. So we were using a standard called XML and moved to one called JSON, which is much more familiar for people building APIs or using APIs today than XML. The other thing that happened was that the W3C, which is the standards body that defines HTML and CSS, it's really the standards body that sets the rules for the web, reached out and said, hey, we want to have a social networking standard and we'd like it to be developed at W3C. So we started a group. So I worked with a few different people from IBM, from Mozilla. I was kind of the independent open sourcey guy. And we brought together a group and made this standard called ActivityPub, which you mentioned before. And that was published in 2019. And that's really been that evolution. Probably the big win for the federated social network was that Mastodon, an open source social networking platform, picked up on ActivityPub just when it was being published and used it for its distributed networking. And that's been super successful. Well, super successful for a distributed social network. It's about 15 to 20 million people. So it's big for, this kind of open experiment. And that's been like a huge part of the success.
Yeah, it's incredible. I've like three questions, I guess. But one is, as you saw sort of the rise of these like closed systems, were you just like, am I taking crazy pills? Like, are people really letting this happen? And I guess I've listened to you on some other podcasts where it really does seem like Twitter in some ways kind of woke people up, like the Elon acquisition had an impact. But even prior to that, did you is it shocking to you that it's come this far? Because it almost felt like this, it felt like it was inevitable that these closed systems were going to win. And now, and we want to get to this about threads, it doesn't feel like it's inevitable at all. And I'd love to kind of just hear your point of view on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in communications theory, there's a really well-established law called Metcalfe's law. And what it says is that for people who are using a communications medium, like the value of that network goes up with the square of the number of people who are on the network, which is very much like mathematical. But what it basically means is that big networks become much, much more valuable than small networks, right? So, as we were seeing like the growth of Facebook, the growth of Twitter, it's a very natural phenomenon that people were going to be sticking with those networks, right? That they were going to be staying on those networks. That's where they wanted to talk. That's where they wanted to be because that's where everybody is. That's where all the jokes are and the news is and et cetera, right? So it makes a lot of sense for people to be kind of sticking in those big networks. I think there are like a couple of big factors that have really kind of changed or altered that equation. First is with Twitter, or we can call it X if you want. I don't know if they actually pronounce it X or Twitter. I haven't heard anyone say it. Let's say Twitter until someone corrects us. What has happened there is that a lot of the participants in that network that were providing value into that network have had that the kind of implicit bargain that was built in has been kind of retracted. So say for news organizations, they had this kind of implicit bargain that if they provided news into the network, stimulating conversation, keeping people engaged, they would be kind of recognized as news organizations, giving a certain, the famous blue check that would say, like, this is a reliable organization. When that was retracted, news organizations had less of an incentive to participate in that network. Now, some still do, actually a lot still do, but others like NPR has said like, hey, this is not a game we're going to play anymore. So that's one thing is like Twitter kind of changing the rules of the game has made it harder, less attractive for all those players to participate in the network. I think the other one that's been a big deal has been anti-competitive legislation, right? Excuse me. What we would call it antitrust legislation to encourage competitiveness. Sorry, I got that backwards. So, especially in the EU, there's been a lot of investigation and effort on their part to say, hey, you can't lock consumers into this platform and never let them out. So these ideas of being able to follow someone on another network, that federation, the data portability, being able to move between networks is starting to get into not quite regulations yet, but definitely in guidance from the EU. And that means that for companies that want to participate in that EU network, they need to start thinking about how do we support this? And that ActivityPub is there for them to actually get started.
And then as a segue to kind of, I guess, and I'm not sure how much you can share, but just, when Instagram announced Threads was going to adopt this, I think, and we talked about this a little bit before the podcast. I'd say like my technical friends were like, holy shit, this is awesome. Like, I can't believe they're actually doing this. And it's funny because a lot of those people don't like Facebook or Meta, and then
Sure.
I have, my other kind of ad tech friends that were like, I don't even know what the hell this thing is. When I click it, I see threads.net. Like, I don't know what this means, but so, I guess from the standpoint though, of the decision they made, do you look at it as maybe a little bit of that regulatory guidance? Like they're almost just trying to embrace the future there. Do you look at it as kind of more of a long-term competition thing, or maybe it is for the reasons that maybe they just want a better user experience? But I'd love to know kind of like, what's your take on it? I assume it's a really positive thing for you guys, but would love to know.
Yeah, boy, there's a lot to unpack in here. Let me start off. First thing is that I don't work for Facebook. I don't have a lot of inside knowledge on their business plan for Threads. So this is all conjecture on my part as a outside observer. But like you said, when they announced it, it was really surprising, I think, for everyone who was working in the area. And I think a lot of folks were like, oh, they're going to support it, but just in this, halfway kind of thing, or in the worst possible way they can. And really, what they've been announcing is a lot of the most positive expectations, right? So having full follow between networks, having data portability between networks, like they're putting it out in their PR is like, this is what we're going to do. I think partly it came from idealistic like engineering staff within Facebook, which there is all over the world, right? There's lots of folks who are like, hey, we should be supporting these standards and these are things that we should do. I think partly it does come from, Facebook's faced like congressional hearings and EU commission stuff, and it's probably part of what affects their decision making. I think also part of it is like what is Threads for, right? And if Threads is for taking out a competitor, which is like part of what it's for, is like further weakening the role of Twitter in the ecosphere, then it's not as important to them that they get all of the Twitter users. What's important to them is that they're draining users out of Twitter, right? And draining attention out of Twitter. So it's like perfectly fine for them is like, we don't have to have all the users. We don't have to have everyone here. We can just like make sure there's an ecosystem that exists and take out Twitter as the like sole arbiter of this part of social networking. So that's another aspect, right? So we call it like commodifying the complement, right? So that, which is what they're doing is they're saying, if you are looking for this kind of news network or celebrity network, you can get it over here. You don't need Twitter, and you get your other stuff from Facebook or Instagram.
Yeah.
Again, amateur economist. I'm not sure if that.
Yeah. I think I've been on. I think a lot of my friends haven't necessarily agree, but I actually do think that Meta, for the most part, tries to do the right thing. I think like 8 times out of 10, something like that, and and I feel like that they, there is a chance I could actually see them adopting this across all the services. Like I think it fits a lot of the narrative that Mark kind of puts out there. I also think, and I'd just love to get kind of your take on this, is when we saw the news, we were sort of just thinking about, it is interesting, kind of to your point, the competitive angle with Twitter, where Elon's talking about how like it's like the freedom platform, and like you can say whatever you want, but like if you can't really like there's a difference in like freedom of speech and like freedom of property, like possession,
Yeah. Yeah.
and and I think they tend to go hand in hand, or like without one, there's really not value to the other, and you could argue that like neither Threads nor Twitter is offering both. Mastodon, I think you probably argue to some extent, is trying to offer
Sure.
both. But it's an interesting sort of like game theory trap with Twitter, because if Twitter were to adopt this, you could imagine people would just move their following over to Threads, probably if the monetization opportunities were bigger.
They could, or they could move the other direction, right? Like it could
Yeah,
go both ways, right? Like that's the thing is, and it's one of the reasons that we like to have competitive markets for software, for toilet paper, for cars, right? Is like as consumers or as users, we tend to get better service when we have a freedom to change our mind, right?
yeah,
And so like I think it would be amazing if Twitter was like, "Hey, you think you're going to pull the rug out from under us by implementing this standard? Well, guess
yeah.
what?
We're,
Like we're
yeah,
on the network too, right? And
totally.
we're part of it."
It's
I think
funny.
it would be a boss move.
Yeah, it's interesting too, and this is obvious. We would love to dive into the monetization part of it with you too. But just thinking, like putting on the capitalist hat, like as that starts to happen, you could start to see like the venture capitalists starting to fund a lot of these projects, because like the ability to for people to finally have a chance to like stand up social networks is incredible. Like all of us have been scared to even try to build things like that. We've all become, we've spent our career building ad tech for the social networks because we're like, we can't really build one ourselves.
Yeah.
And for this reason. So it's really, really fascinating how it could change all that.
Well, I think that's one thing that's really interesting is like for innovation and entrepreneurship, right? Because if you start a new social network today, 2023, actually, let's say 2020, you have to build up a critical mass of users before it becomes valuable. And if you don't do that within a few months, you crash and burn, right? You lose all those users because it's not a fun place to be. They're not finding what they need out of the network. If you start a new Fediverse service today in 2023, you start off with 20 million users on Mastodon. And then in a few months, when Threads comes, you've got another 150 million users, right? So you have this huge audience to work with that brings a lot of value to your users, right? So it's a really like it's a different you're starting off from year 4 or year 5 instead of like starting off from zero,
Yeah.
which is really amazing for innovators.
With that, I guess, how do you think about the incumbents in the space, right? How do incumbents either adopt this or defend against this? Because you're talking about Meta that did over $100 billion last year. Even Snapchat and Pinterest are doing billions of dollars in revenue, and a lot of that is the protection they have around their users, the data that they have to be more efficient in advertising. And so, how do you think these companies can balance both the revenue opportunity, the kind of moat that they've built, while maybe opening up? And maybe the answer is they can't.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. So, it comes down to numbers, right? So like if you are a network that is smaller than that kind of global network, then it's going to make a lot of sense for you to join into that network, right? So if you are a network of like 2 million users or 10 million users, when you see that opportunity to connect with that Threads universe, right, there's going to be a very compelling interest. It for networks that are much bigger, it's going to take a while for them to see the compelling value to it, right? So I think what we'll probably see happen is smaller networks start joining, right? So, and when we're talking about smaller in the world of social networks, we're talking like tens of millions, hundreds of millions of users, but let's say smaller there. we'll see smaller ones attach themselves to it, implement the standards, start connecting, and then that big ball, that big internetwork gets bigger and bigger. And as it becomes bigger than the other social networks, they start seeing the value. I think that there's a great point for those bigger networks to be looking right now, right? So if you are let's say Pinterest, it's probably a good idea to be doing the investigation, experimentation today rather than waiting until it's time that you need it. Because it does take time to like prepare to implement a protocol like this. Yeah. But yeah.
And as there's I have like 1,000 questions. It's so cool. The is there a reasonable thesis to think too that like even on like putting on like the business hat, like from an OpEx perspective, like if I'm Pinterest right now, like I'm spending so much time like defending my user base and trying to think of ways to grow that like inherently, like if I could make this sort of, if I could switch to your guys' protocol and have access to the broader network, the theory should be that like I can innovate on the user experience in a much better way. And you could probably move past this period of like what feels like commoditization across every social network that we see.
Yeah.
Like if there can be one example of that, do you think that's sort of another, like when that happens, people are going to be like, okay, this is like, I've been just putting so much time and effort into something that just like doesn't need to be. Is that like a
Yeah,
fair?
absolutely. I mean, so as a social network, right? Whatever, 80%, 90% of your users are making little or no money for you, right? Like they're a cost center for you. You are paying them to be an audience, right? And you're paying them to be an audience for the other 10 to 20% who are actually providing value to you as a company, right? And it's like, hey, what if you just shed those 80%, let them go wherever else, right? Let them go to Facebook, let them go out on Mastodon, or maybe their cell phone provider provides them an account, or whoever. Like, not your problem. You concentrate on the users that are actually generating value for you. They're generating the content that you can put advertisement on, or they're paying a premium, right? You can kind of like go into focusing on what the real business is. And that's a really amazing opportunity, right? I think that when Facebook talks about what they want to do with threads, they're like, hey, we want to have Oprah and the Pope on here, right? And give them a platform that they can use to broadcast out to the wider world, right? And I think that that's and it's an interesting strategy. Now, not everyone can have it. Not everyone can have that strategy, right? Not everyone can be the celebrity platform.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there's going to be an opportunity for a lot of niche. Do you have better analytics? Do you do a better job with broadcasting? Do you do better like user interface? Like, there's so many things that platforms can provide.
And have you guys thought about, again, like putting kind of our ads hat, like a lot of these things represent, in some ways they look and feel almost like how ad networks work, where like, if you think of like, probably the most interesting ad network over the last few years, which has now been hurt by a lot of Apple's changes, was the Facebook audience network, where Facebook had their family of apps. And then basically they use all that data to serve targeted ads across primarily mobile apps and games. And it was great. Like now some game had the ability to monetize this audience. And now it ended up being, Apple looked at it as like privacy invasive, and it may have been in some ways. But have you guys thought about having like monetization as part of at the protocol layer? And like, have you guys toyed around with, like, it's part of me looks at like, I've looked at some of these, blockchain protocols where there's like a token around, like the BAT is one where they, to some extent, have you guys thought about like, is there a way to create a economic incentive for kind of moving these audiences around, or you think that's kind of at the app level and the protocol stays the protocol?
Yeah, that's a super good question, right? So right now, the protocol does not have a monetization layer in it, right? So there's not a payment mechanism. However, there are lots of like points at which you could insert monetization, right? One simple one, right, is a subscription mechanism, right? So instead of, and we've seen this with Twitter where you have premium posts, but there are some, or with Substack, but having the kind of thing where it's like, hey, I have a premium feed, and if you want to follow me, you only get my premium posts if you're a paid member, right? And that's one model that seems to work for certain kinds of content. In terms of advertisement, there's kind of 2 insertion points for advertisement. One is within the app that you're using, right? So is it on your cell phone, you've got a feed, and somewhere on the app it's got a banner.
Yep.
The other is within the stream, so ads within the stream, which is what we've gotten used to with, say, Twitter, Facebook, et cetera, is in-stream advertisement that's inserted in there. It is definitely possible, has its downsides because the way that Twitter and Facebook make that work is that they have very stringent API requirements that keep you from removing those ads. So none of the third-party apps are able to remove ads or take them out of the stream or filter them, et cetera. Whereas it's an open protocol for ActivityPub, so users can easily remove those if they wanted to, right? I think that aligning the advertisement broadcasting through into in-stream is something that's going to be possible. It's going to be interesting to see like where it gets inserted, how filtering works, etc. Right? And TBD. It's not common on the Fediverse right now. Probably the more common one is like on platform, right? So you'll see it in web interfaces. You'll see banners. Very little in stream, and even very little influencer or sponsored content. So,
yeah, it'd be interesting. Again, hopefully, people like us don't ruin what you guys are trying to do. But but as you hear it, it's interesting that you could potentially have an app who is adopting the protocol, have ways to monetize users that came in through them at one point. Like there's a little bit of like a co-op system that you could imagine like over time creating interesting incentives and still holding within, I think, what like the incentives of the protocol itself is.
right.
And yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I think that I think that for folks who want to build a business on the Fediverse, this is a great time to get involved, right? Because you can start defining the structures that everyone else is going to follow in years to come, right? So we don't yet have like a good influencer sponsored ads model for influencers on the Fediverse, which we have seen somewhat in Instagram, somewhat in other systems, and it's a wide open field for someone to do. Include me in your friends and family IPO, please.
Okay.
And but like there is a lot to see here where it's like, oh, there are opportunities to make money. How do I do it? One of the things that's different is because you were talking about that data portability, which makes it really frictionless, is like you can't think about captive audiences, right?
Yeah.
You can't think that people aren't going to slip out and go do something else if you push it too far. So I think what we're going to see a really nice balance between what users want, what businesses want in terms of like how those advertising structures work out.
Super interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think we could go on and on, but for the sake of time, your time mostly, we can get into maybe our famous rapid fire round where we just ask you a handful of questions and then we'll close it out. So let's start. You've talked a lot about social and where it's been over the last 10, 15, 20 years. What's your personal favorite social platform to use?
My personal favorite social platform was the List app by BJ Novak. It was a great app.
Okay. And then, I guess similar to that, what is one company you'd love to see join ActivityPub?
Tumblr. I think it would be a great one to come in.
Okay.
And a question along those lines too. This is to show kind of our like naivety about this stuff, but if someone like we have a bunch of friends at like Snapchat and Spotify and Reddit Pinterest, if they are interested in exploring this more, should they try to find you, reach out to you on your social channels and start diving in?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm Evan Prodromou. You can find me on LinkedIn. Easy to contact me. I'd love to talk. So, officially, I'm part of the W3C social web community group. So I'm happy and I continue to edit the documents, and I can give advice or help people get onboarded. Yeah.
Okay. We'll include your LinkedIn there, link to the W3C, and kind of any other information you think might be helpful for folks to learn more.
Absolutely.
Okay. You've clearly done a lot in your career. It doesn't seem like you're slowing down anytime soon. So what's the next company that either you'd love to start or kind of help accelerate?
Oh, that's a great question. I think my two great loves right now, first is federated social networks. A lot of what I'd like to do is help big networks get connected to the Fediverse, right? So I think that is plenty of work for the next few years, whether that's as part of my professional work or as part of my off time. The other thing that I work on right now is I work for a nonprofit doing climate change, open source software to fight climate change. We build software that helps cities manage their carbon footprint, put together climate plans, et cetera. It's a hard thing to walk away from. It really feels like an important time to be involved in it.
Yeah. What's that company's name, and where can folks learn more?
Oh, sure. It's called Open Earth Foundation. We can be found at openearth.org.
Okay.
And our product is called City Catalyst.
Okay. Great. And so we, after listening to a few of your podcasts, seeing some of your interviews, we heard that you're writing a novel. Is that correct?
Yeah. I started writing a novel a very long time ago. I've been procrastinating on it ever since, and writing software and starting companies instead of finishing my novel. So actually, I'm looking to write a book about the Fediverse now. So keep an eye out there.
Okay.
Just in terms of providing guidance, technical and business guidance.
Okay. So if any publishers are listening, this is the opportunity to get in. And then going back in your career, you were the founder of WikiTravel. So what are some of the favorite places that either you visited or want to visit, around the world?
Boy, so I really love Crete in Greece. Beautiful place to go. Still very wild. Wonderful place to visit. I love Cape Breton Island in Canada, very nearby where I live now. And in terms of the West Coast, I love Catalina Island off the coast of California. Beautiful place to visit. Really, really love it. Meaningful memories.
Awesome. Well, Evan, we really appreciate you joining us today. I think you've said it at different points in the podcast, but just one time, where can listeners find you online? Where can they learn more?
Great question. So you can find me online at cosocial.ca/Evan. That's my Fediverse account. So it's cosocial, cosocial.ca/Evan, and I'll share that link. And then you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter at EvanPro if you really want to bug me there. I don't like getting messages there. And those are probably the best ways to contact me.
Okay, awesome. Well, we'll see you on the Fediverse then.
All right. Thanks a lot. Looking forward to it.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Before you go, we need your help. If you enjoyed this week's episode of Taking Inventory, then subscribe or rate wherever you listen to the podcast. And while you're at it, please share this episode or your favorite episode with a friend. We'll be back next week with another episode of Taking Inventory.